Hello, this is Christian Perry, and here I am to give you an introduction to the Introduction to Philosophy. This is going to be a short slideshow, and I'm just going to go over some of the basics of stuff that will follow later on. This course will be covering what we might loosely call the Western tradition. It's a problematic term in many ways, but uh, basically it's about something like Western Europe, and so we'll be including a lot of the central figures that you've heard about in philosophy, people like Plato and Aristotle and Descartes and Immanuel Kant. So it's definitely kind of a mainstream course like that. But it's not just focused on those people. There will be some non-Western material. We'll be looking at some Chinese and Indian philosophy, uh, people like Confucius, and we'll look at some religious traditions, which are from non-Western sources too. Uh, the course will also include aspects which are investigating the non-philosophical side. So we'll look at some myths. Uh, Fairly obviously, we'll be looking at some religions, Christianity and Islam, and also some ancient Greek myths, religions. Exactly what the difference is there is a little hazy, I would say. We'll look a little bit at art, some of the history of art and how that relates to cultural movements. And we'll definitely be thinking about the rise of science and scientific thought. We're going to start fairly early on, around 800 BCE, before the Common Era, with people like Homer and Hesiod. You may well have heard of the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. And we'll go up around to the late 19th century. We'll see how it goes. But that's the aim. So to do all that in a fairly short space of time means we're not really going to go deep, rather we're going to go fast. And there's the arguments for and against going different ways, but that's the way I've decided to do it this time. So strap yourselves in. To do a course like this, which covers a huge amount of ground, you need some structure. You need some way to tie things together. Otherwise, it's just a bunch of random ideas which don't really fit together. So the whole point is to try and fit things together. So there's a point of comparison between different people and different texts and ideas, and you're able to see connections as you go through the course. So, we'll be addressing pretty broad issues, such as what have we got to learn from these past traditions, and how valuable are they, and what sort of attitude should we take towards these past traditions, these past thinkers. Uh, Now, I'm going to take the view, which I think is pretty uncontroversial, although it may not be accepted by everyone, that science is our best guide to the truth, and that when we can, we should turn to science for answers. And so a lot of the people we will be discussing were writing or talking or investigating during a pre-scientific era where they didn't really have science. So the sort of natural assumption then is that, well, if science is the best way to know things and they didn't have science, then they couldn't really know very much, which is going to raise the issue of why should we think these people are valuable? What have they got to tell us? And it does mean there's going to be a little bit of a skeptical attitude towards their ideas. It means that we're not automatically going to assume that they're right or even that they're partially right, that they have something important to say. We're leaving open the possibility that really, although these people were of great historical significance, they really didn't have anything much to say. And so we're going to leave open this skeptical conclusion as a possibility. Indeed, it might even be a sort of default assumption for a lot of these past traditions. So then we'll be looking, well, if science is going to be our main guide to what to believe, then what else do we need? And if we need something else in addition to science, what can they give us? What sorts of wisdom or help do these other traditions, these other thinkers have to give us to supplement our scientific investigations? So, what issues are there that science cannot really decide? I think an interesting one is life after death. A lot of religious traditions say that humans will survive their physical deaths and they go on existing in some other form. Uh, there's been all sorts of different stories about what that form is. Maybe it's going to an underworld, maybe it's going to heaven. There's ideas of reincarnation. There's all sorts of different ways to think about that. Ghosts are also interesting. Uh, now, if you think about the scientific investigation of those things, it seems that there is scientific investigation of things like ghosts, and uh, some people claim that they have proof of the existence of ghosts, but science hasn't really kind of come around to really believing that or accepting that. If you uh, take science in a university, then you'll find that there is no course called the science of ghosts. Uh, there's no uh, there's no accepted scientific tradition which will tell us about life after death. So it does seem that kind of science has largely rejected the idea of life after death. That that doesn't mean that individual scientists don't believe in it, but people will seem to have non-scientific reasons for believing in life after death. And then the question is, well, what kind of reasons could there be? So we'll be thinking about those sorts of reasons. What reasons could we have for thinking that there is a life after death? And then there's things like supernatural forces. In order to know what supernatural is, you also have to have an idea of what the natural is. And so you need to have a distinction between natural and supernatural. And that might be a difficult distinction to really formulate, although we have a rough idea of what our current physics, chemistry, biology tells us are possible, and then what would be impossible. And so supernatural forces would go beyond our current understanding of science. So there may be kind of supernatural forces, maybe, I don't know, maybe mind reading, or kind of some kind of ability to move objects with our minds, uh, or the idea of trying to affect the future with things like curses or prayers. So there's all sorts of supernatural ideas that people tend to entertain. Maybe the ultimate idea of the supernatural is a god or gods. there's been all sorts of ideas of gods over human history, and it's worth thinking about, you know, what sorts of evidence there is for things like that. Is there any sort of scientific proof? It would seem that if there is a massively powerful supernatural force in the universe, uh, shouldn't it be kind of measurable or detectable, something that we would actually see? Uh, and the fact that it's rather hard to find any evidence for such things does raise the suspicion that, in fact, that's all an illusion, that it doesn't really exist at all. But maybe there are some reasons for a supernatural, powerful force to remain hidden and quiet and somehow behind the scenes. So there's a sort of speculation about that, which we can try and think about. A big sort of idea that is important for a lot of human history is whether people are equal or unequal. For a lot of human history, it's been pretty much assumed that uh, people are unequal, that there are the natural aristocracy, and then there's maybe some middle level of free people, and then there's going to be slaves. Exactly how many levels there are to the stratification is going to depend on society, and how flexible that stratification is also going to depend on society. One of the marks of what we call the modern era, from like the 16th, 17th, 18th century, is that there's an increasing belief in equality, the idea that everybody is equal. And there's clearly been ways in which that equality has been sort of qualified. And so there's been ideas, oh yeah, everybody's equal, but not women, or everybody's equal, but not slaves. So uh, it's taken a while for us to believe in total equality, and maybe we still don't really believe in total equality, but there is this movement over the recent centuries to believe in greater equality. So then the question is, well, what does that mean? Is that a scientific claim that everybody has equal abilities? Because if it is, it seems unlikely because people have different abilities. Um, so if it's not a scientific claim, then what kind of claim is it? And that's an issue which needs a good deal of unpacking of thought. Uh, and it's related to the idea that every person has something called dignity. The idea of human dignity is a very powerful idea that's had a lot of pull on various thinkers, and so we definitely want to explore that. Uh, there's also, when we're talking about going beyond science, there's the general idea of moral obligations. Where does morality come from? Is morality real, or is morality an invention? And if morality is real, then how do we get to know about it? Who can tell us about morality? Are there experts? What models are there for us to really know about reality? So those are at least a bunch of issues of what we might investigate when we're going beyond science, and why looking at the past might be helpful to give us some information about that. Those are all pretty kind of standard philosophical topics. There is a question these days about whether there's an additional crisis that we need to be facing. Certainly, there seems to be an ecological crisis about the climate, about our ability to feed ourselves, and with a growing population, whether that's going to increase. There's worries about storms and weather extremes. Uh, and so there's also political worries about nuclear war, about biological terrorism, and our general ability to prevent severe communicable diseases. Uh, Certainly, there's all sorts of reasons these days where I think many people feel like uh, the world is coming to a state where we just can't go on as we have before. And there's and that's been true in the past too. There's been many times in the past where there's been a great amount of turmoil, and the world has fundamentally changed as a result of that turmoil. So we have to then kind of think, well, take this idea seriously. Is it really true that we need to start rethinking our assumptions about the world? And I think it may well be that looking at the past, these past ideas, uh, even if these past thinkers don't give us answers about how to think about the future, uh, still they give us the kind of material to use to see how intellectual and political and other sorts of turmoil led to new ways of doing things. So it's going to be useful for us to look at this past in a way that helps us to think about the future and what many people would regard as a global crisis. Uh, and it may well be that we need to fundamentally rethink the structure of society, the ways that we approach the world, our priorities, and what we think is even kind of real. So, given that, there are ways in which this course could be helpful in approaching those sorts of issues. So, what we're hoping for from this course is that it'll give you a sense of perspective on the past, an understanding of the present in regards to the past, a kind of broad view of history, of intellectual thought, of culture, and through that sort of perspective, you'll have a better understanding of how things are now and how we might proceed for the future, both as a society and also just for you individually to think about how are you going to negotiate your life. Uh, as I've already emphasized, uh, I am not bringing in these past thinkers for you to just admire them and say, oh, yeah, they were so great. Uh, it may well be that we find huge flaws in the ways they go about things. There are fundamental assumptions and the ways that their ideas were used through history. It may be that we find them, in fact, far from admirable, but they were influential, and we can see how their work was used, and that may lead us to think about how we approach big ideas now. It may lead us to be a little cautious about using them. We may think that looking at the past shows us how many mistakes people made by being kind of tied to certain ideas, and how things would have been better if they hadn't been so tied to those ideas. So it may be that we need to actually be more flexible in our thought rather than just sticking to some one specific system of thought. But that's all up in the air. The idea is that looking at the past will help people come to think about the future in some way or other. And so that the fundamental hope is that doing this course will help you in thinking for yourself and free you from your kind of past of assumptions which you may have made, and you may be making false assumptions. You may be making assumptions that you can no longer agree with. And so it's a way for you to really test yourself and think about what you really believe and how you want to live your life. That's the hope. It's a big goal, but why not? Let's go for it.